Thiago Santos in this fight, but I kind of think we have to get exposure to both sides. But I'm going to ask you, do you have a lean here, Pete?
Hold on one second.
Having some issues? All right. Well, it seems like Pete's having some issues either with audio or something else. I see him looking at me. But can you hear us, Pete?
Yeah, I believe we're live now. For a while we weren't. Okay, perfect. All right. My apologies, guys. But I will say that this main event is a fight that I am prioritizing for my lineups. I'm okay with getting either way. I think the safer play is definitely Thiago Santos. You just see his resume, his strength of schedule against legitimate competition. Yes, he's older. Yes, he's had a ton of injuries throughout his career, and they're starting to accumulate now. You have a rising star in Johnny Walker, who is extremely volatile because of his defensive mislaps. He's extremely reckless, so he makes plenty of mistakes. So I actually went like really, really aggressive with this fight, Greg. I think it's in the optimal lineup. I have almost 100% of this fight in my lineups. I just don't see how this goes the distance, and I don't see how it doesn't pay off.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at just the overall betting odds in this fight, it is minus 120 for over under 1.5 rounds, but under 2.5 rounds is minus 215. So the odds of finish here super, super high. Overall, minus, depending what book you look at, it's as high as minus 650 to finish inside the distance. That's what the line they have is up over at DK right now. So it's a fight that I think there's massive upside. There's also variance to it, though, just because I mentioned with Johnny Walker, he comes out of the gate just like a bat out of hell, and he's so dangerous for the first few minutes of the fight. But we've also seen, if you extend him past those first few minutes, he doesn't really have too much left in the gas tank. We saw that against Nikita Krylov, who was just kind of able to take him down or hold him down at will. And, we've seen that didn't really happen against Corey Anderson, but something that was probably going to happen against Corey Anderson had that fight not ended by Corey Anderson knockout as quickly as it did. So I still I still feel like we need to get exposure to both sides of this fight at a really high clip, just because if Johnny Walker wins, the upside is so high. I know you lean towards Santos here, but is it still something where you're liking both sides a decent amount?
Yeah, I like both sides. I actually have a ton of Johnny Walker because I think for 2 rounds he's extremely dangerous, and we have seen Thiago Santos, his volume be lackadaisical at times, and I think if he's not aggressive, he could get walked down. He has an excellent counter shot where a good check hook could possibly turn the tide of this fight, but I think that as far as aggression, Johnny Walker's really going to bring it out of him. So and I like the salary savings. And I think for a weekend like this, to get a little contrarian, to leave more salary on the table is why I ended up getting slightly more Johnny Walker than I did Thiago Santos.
So I know you said this is a really high priority fight for you. Is it a fight that you're playing in all of your lineups, or is there some lineups you made that don't include this fight?
Very few lineups don't have this fight, Greg. And I think it's just because of the nature of it. The worst case scenario would probably be like a low volume 3rd round finish where we're sitting there with, barely scratching the surface of 90 points or something like that. And I'm like, damn. But I think that this is going to finish within 10 minutes, if we're being honest.
Yeah, so the betting odds also indicate that's likely going to be the case. I personally have it in 80% of my lineups. It's still obviously a very healthy portion of my current build. The only thing that gives me a little bit of pause is that Thiago Santos's last few fights have been a little lackluster compared to where it was earlier in his career. That last time he fought against Alexander Rakic, that fight was viewed as something that was like a can't miss barn burner. That fight, I think, if I remember correctly, it finished like minus 400 to finish inside the distance. The fight ends, almost nothing ends up happening. Personally, I thought Santos should have won. It ended up being with Rakic won a unanimous decision, but significant strikes in that fight. It was 49 for Santos. It was 36 for Rakic. Both of them were super hesitant and weren't really willing to throw volume. I'm a little concerned that what happens if there isn't a quick finish in this fight. Do these guys just kind of end up staring at each other a lot? Because, also Thiago Santos' title fight against John Jones, 5-round fight. John Jones ends up landing 59 significant strikes in 5 rounds. Santos lands 43. So once again, I'm playing in 80% of my lineups, but the only reason I'm not 100% is because I do have some of those concerns.
Yeah, I think those are legitimate concerns. And for me, I look at the opponents that were a little bit more methodical. Rakic, John Jones. I don't really put Johnny Walker in that category. I feel like he's still mean and aggressive. And I think that, he likes to hunt finishes, and I think he wants to push the pace of this fight. I think he understands that the later this fight goes, the more it will definitely lean in Thiago Santos's favor. So for me, like I think the pace of the fight could end up elevating totals compared to other fights. I would be very, very surprised if this is not a part of the optimal lineup. But I think 80%, if you are trying to play like, the majority of the field, I think that makes a ton of sense. I'm an aggressive player, and sometimes I like unchecking people. Sometimes I like creating groups. That's how I play DFS, and that's how I prefer to do it. If I'm wrong on the fight, it's okay. But I think that me having 100% of my lineups in a certain direction can definitely get me up above the field who's maybe a little bit more, conservative.
Yep. And I have no issue taking a stand, especially on a fight like this, where you look at, massive ownership, about 40% projected ownership on Santos, 40% projected to go to Walker. So the field's going to be very heavy on this fight. But, there's also a lot of other spots I want to target. And one of them is the co-main event, Kevin Holland versus Kyle Daukaus, where if you just look at the metrics, I think this is a very favorable looking matchup for Kyle Daukaus, just from a standpoint of Kyle Daukaus is a willing wrestler. What have we seen from Kevin Holland in his recent fights? He just gets taken down just at will, rinse and repeat with zero takedown defense. Now, he's made it a very big point to say, like, hey, I've been working on my takedown defense. He talks about all the work he's been doing with Johnny Hendricks. And it's hard for me to totally buy into it, though. And I look at some of our current ownership projections right now where Kevin Holland is going to be a chalk play on the slate. Kyle Daukaus is only projected for 16% ownership. Considering that information and the upside I perceive to be in Daukaus if he's going to look to wrestle here, I really like Daukaus as a GPP play. Are you on the same page as me?
Anytime there's an underdog with wrestling and grappling upside, you have my attention. And I think that Daukaus has the skills to kind of follow the same blueprint that was laid out against Derek Brunson. If you even go back against the fight that Holland had against Darren Stewart, where he arguably lost that fight. He was controlled in moments, and he does struggle with the scrambling ability of some of his opponents. Like, he can defend, the initial takedown, but it's the chaining of the takedowns that he tends to struggle with. And get, if he's able to, conquer the footwork battle, stay in the center of the cage, I like his chances. But from what I've seen from Daukaus, he's a very, very long guy. He can strike, with Kevin Holland. I really think he can. And then on a wide shot, I think that he can press forward, pin him against the cage, and start to, utilize some, inner reaps and some, some trips that he likes to do in the clinch. He's a big guy. And if you look at the weigh-ins yesterday, you'll notice that, Kevin Holland is slim and he looks like he's in good shape. Daukaus looks like a wide body for the division. Like, he's a very, very big guy. And, doesn't really look to be in the best shape as far as like, oh man, like he looks incredible. But I'm saying he's going to be the heavier of the two. And I think that weight could actually weigh on Kevin Holland. I had to bump up a little bit of my Kevin Holland exposure because it was extremely light. And I compared it with ownership. And I'm like, man, I'm a little light on the Kevin Holland side. But I do think that he has the power and the skills standing up to knock out anybody. But for me, this is like, why have this matchup? You just struggled against recent wrestlers. I think there are better fights for you. I know you want to prove that, I've fixed my wrestling, but you also kind of rushed camp to camp and you haven't allowed yourself to really absorb the sport of wrestling. Like, it takes some time to absorb. Like, take a couple months off. You just fought more times in the COVID era than anybody. So take a couple months off, refine your skills, then get back in there, and then you can really start to defend some of these takedowns and let your skills fly.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you about that. And by the way, also on the overall physicality of Kyle Daukaus, I mean, that guy's shaped like whatever container you put him in. He's just totally like a shapeless amoeba. You put him in an oddly shaped shirt, and that's what his shape is. But I also want to ask, how much do you buy into Kevin Holland working on his takedown defense? Because here's where I stand. This goes for MMA, this goes for baseball, basketball, really anything. When an athlete says that they've made changes, I have to see it to believe it. And is it possible Kevin Holland has improved takedown defense and then I could reevaluate him after the fight? For sure. But it's been so poor in recent fights. He was taken down 6 times by Marvin Vettori. He was taken down 11 times by Marvin Vettori, 6 times by Derek Brunson. He ends up finishing Jotko in a really weird finish in the first round, his fight before that. But Jotko took him down 2 times. Whatever, he fought Charlie Ontiveros, that not a UFC level fighter, finished him quickly. Darren Stewart, who is not known as an offensive wrestler, takes him down 3 times. I think the line is just wrong here. It's not to say that I think that there should be massive money in terms of Daukaus being the favorite, but he's a plus 150 underdog, and just based on the metrics and some of the performances we've seen from Kevin Holland recently, this seems like a good matchup for Daukaus. But I'll have to ask you, after kind of my long prelude there, how much do you buy into that he's going to have improved wrestling defense?
I know firsthand how difficult it is to absorb different parts of the sport that you're not familiar with. I was a high level striker coming over to MMA, and it took me a little bit, and it's a rough learning curve when you're paired up against guys that are a little bit more well rounded than you, or that have that wrestling in the back pocket. I'm sure all throughout his career he's been training his wrestling, but there's a clear deficiency in that area. So I know that I'm not really going to buy into too much of that. I'm going to take a slight wait and see approach. I think that what he can do is combine the possible improved takedown defense with better footwork, better cage awareness. And, the combination of all those can somewhat make it seem like you have better takedown defense when really you don't. I think the scrambling area is the hardest part about wrestling and jiu-jitsu that is somewhat overlooked. And that's where I am favoring, Daukaus in the fight. It's not like, oh, yeah, I'm sure Kevin Holland knows, you got to get a wizard. You got to fight for an underhook. You got to, spin off the cage. But what happens if it does hit the mat, or what happens if there is a scramble where it's not the initial takedown? So I'm not really buying into it. That's going to, materialize into his return fight because it does seem so rushed. I think that there is value on Daukaus, and I'm okay with getting to the underdog here.
Yeah, and then also just to address, and by the way, I see the super chat from Michael Hammer. I'll answer that in a second. I just wanted to give some closing thoughts on this fight because I think it's a pretty important one for this card. Is also when it comes to Daukaus, I'm not going out and saying that I'm super confident he wins. I just think the line and the ownership is a little bit off here. So when I see that this is a favorable matchup with high upside for Daukaus, I'm only projecting for 16% ownership compared to 35% for Kevin Holland. That's really where I look at Daukaus and think that he makes sense as a value option, also considering some of the leverage there. But as for Michael Hammer and your super chat, also, thank you for leaving the super chat. Also, now the question: what fights or fighters are you unchecking, if any, Pete? So which fights do you just don't view as having upside?
Yeah, it's Betch Correia. I have zero interest in Betch Correia. I understand that women's MMA is somewhat volatile and it's closer than what it seems, but you're talking about a retirement fight where she's made it public. It's a retirement fight. She's struggled to make weight because it seems like she doesn't. Yeah, exactly. Like it seems like she doesn't care. Like she's like, yeah, it's my last one. What are they going to do to me? You see somewhat mentally checked out. I don't think that it's a favorable matchup for her at all. She likes to strike. She likes to initiate the clinch. I think she's going to be out volumed by Karol Rosa. I think Karol Rosa can present a takedown threat. I just see Karol Rosa, somewhat dominating in this fight or coasting. So, I mean, Betch Correia is just a fighter that I'm not getting to. If anybody else feels comfortable with that and trying to target a low-owned fighter, by all means, go ahead. It ain't going to be me. I don't care. I'm not going after Betch Correia. I think she's going to get absolutely destroyed today.
Yeah, I really like this matchup for Karol Rosa for a couple reasons, not just for the matchup against Betch Correia, who has more than 1 foot out the door. She's basically entirely out the door. And just like, I assume this is for a paycheck. When she's announced her retirement, she said this is a retirement fight, and then doesn't even really come remotely close to making weight. So that leads me to believe that she didn't train super hard for this fight. And then Rosa is gold for fantasy purposes. She's such high output. 7.73 significant strikes landed per minute. She also is a willing wrestler. She lands 2 takedowns per 15 minutes. I just think she's going to put on a pace on Betch Correia that she's not going to be able to keep up with. And actually, I'm kind of curious to see. I'm going to look this up while I'm asking your next question. But what do you think of the chance of Rosa winning by a 3rd round finish here? Just based on the fact that Correia does not seem to be in the best shape possible for this fight. And Rosa just fights with such a pace that I'm going to look at those odds right now. It wasn't something I really thought of until we were talking about it. But 3rd round finish, I think her just kind of melting her with pressure seems like it's on the table here.
Definitely on the table. Worth the sprinkle for sure. I will say that Betch Correia does have some skills to somewhat stifle the offense or the takedown threat of Karol Rosa. Or I think like Karol Rosa has that takedown advantage over most opponents. I think that, she could be met with some resistance, but I think the cardio and the shape of Correia is what's going to abandon her. So I do like that third round sprinkle. I think Carol Hossa is a phenomenal fighter. I like her on this slate. I am not worried, but I do like, I don't know. I guess I am slightly worried that she doesn't pay off the price tag, but there's nothing in the history of her fights in the UFC to prove me any otherwise that she's going to go out there and not get 100 points. Yeah, it does seem like a softball matchup for Carol Hossa at this point. And, Correia really did kind of screw herself because missing weight, she's not even eligible for a, a bonus. So it's like, yeah, if you're doing for a paycheck, you really just kind of just, are going for your show in your win purse. I don't know. I really like Carol Hossa, worth a third round sprinkle. The high volume is going to be a little too much.
Yeah, so I just put I threw $50 on a 14-1 to finish by third round finish. I think that she's
That's nice.
live to finish in that way. And then also talking about Carol Hossa, her fantasy output. So here are her DraftKings scores in her 3 fights that she's had: 111 fantasy points, 109, 108.5. She fights and by the way, all of those were decision wins. She has 0 finishes, and she's still scoring well over 100 fantasy points in all those wins. And she's a massive favorite today. So put all that information together. When she wins, she scores well. She's like a minus 600 favorite. And I think all of that makes sense. And, there's a bunch of fighters to consider on the high end. And, I'd like to ask you about this as well, Pete. We just talked about the merits of Carol Hossa, but there's also Alexander Hernandez. He's a big favorite on my end. There's really only 2 big favorites on the card. It's Hossa and Alexander Hernandez. If you could only roster one of them today, which is the one that you prefer to get more exposure to?
Oh, absolutely. It's Carol Hossa. Like Alexander Hernandez is very inconsistent, and you don't really know what version you're going to get of him. Early on in his career, he was a knockout threat, burst onto the scene, short notice replacement, and then he started showing some capability of taking people down. And you're like, wow, this kid has a solid, wrestling game to go with his good striking. I mean, he landed 4 takedowns against Olivier Aubin-Mercier, and I'm like, wow, Aubin-Mercier is really damn good. Then over the course of his career, attempted 2 takedowns, 1 takedown, 5 takedowns, and then up to this point, 0 in his past 2. Started to fall in love with his hands, starting to become a little safer of a fighter. I also think that his cardio is something to question, because he does seem like he falls off a cliff at some points when he's met with resistance, and that cardio liability is what I'm a little hesitant about. This is a fight where you're facing a guy on short notice, and Mike Breeden, coming from a very strong camp in Glory MMA with James Krause. You already know he's going to be prepared. Yes, it is on short notice. You already know that they're going to be, well schooled and taught in all areas. So if Hernandez has a drop off, I think that Breeden, coming back isn't the craziest thing. But on paper, if you look at who Hernandez has fought, he's fought legitimate competition: Beneil Dariush, Olivier Aubin-Mercier, Donald Cerrone, Trinaldo, Dober, Grutzmacher, Thiago Moises. There's no reason why he shouldn't be able to go through Mike Breeden in this situation. If, on paper, this looks like another softball matchup, but I'm just a little hesitant because of his volume. I feel like he's a little bit reserved sometimes because he wants to save some gas for the third round. I prefer Carol Hossa in a retirement fight over that, but I still think that I have a decent amount of Hernandez exposure.
Yeah, and they are still, to me, the 2. Actually, I think we could throw Casey O'Neill in the mix too, in terms of fighters that are priced over 9K. My 3 favorite are Casey O'Neill, Carol Hossa, and Alexander Hernandez. It's not to say that there aren't merits to say like Douglas Silva de Andrade or Alejandro Perez, and we'll talk about them in a second. But with Casey O'Neill, from what we've seen from her, also somebody just from a fantasy standpoint, she is so aggressive with wrestling and grappling that when she wins, she scores massive fantasy points. Her 2 fights in the UFC against Shayna Dobson and Laura Procopio, she scored 139.5 fantasy points and scored 109.6. And she was an underdog in her last fight against Procopio, still scores over 100 fantasy points. Against Shayna Dobson, she puts up nearly 140 fantasy points. It's only a minus 140 favorite. So I look at this spot for her, and, against Antonina Shevchenko, it is on paper her hardest matchup just in terms of the quality of opponent. But we've seen from Shevchenko that she can be beat once she's taken to the ground. She only has 50% takedown defense. And given, exactly 50% takedown defense, given that Casey O'Neill lands 3.47 takedowns per 15 minutes, I think this is a really favorable matchup for her on paper, and there is significant upside should she win. It's a really good matchup, even if the opponent is a step up in competition.
Yeah, so it's the biggest name on her resume, right? Or to this point, it's the biggest name that she's fought. And I think the UFC knows what they're doing in matching these two up, because as far as Shevchenko, they're not doing her any favors in this matchup. You are the sister of Valentina. You are held to a high standard. Now that you haven't really materialized into the same fighter, or there's a clear gap in skill between the two sisters. Now the UFC is a business, and they're going to sit there and say, okay, we have a rising star. Let's see if we can have this rising star somewhat make a name off of the last name Shevchenko. I think that if Shevchenko keeps it on the feet, she can have some success, because a lot of people will look at Casey O'Neill and say, wow, well, her striking's a little green to this point, despite her father being an accomplished kickboxer. I would say that's just a small sample size from what we've dealt with, right? We've seen Casey O'Neill dominate in the excellent wrestling and grappling situations, her top pressure. I've heard amazing things about her in the training room as well, where she's relentless, beating the hell out of some guys. I think that Casey O'Neill is one of my most exposed fighters on the slate, given the deficiency in Shevchenko's game, because Shevchenko will initiate the clinch. And when she initiates the clinch, she does not have the same skills that her sister Valentina does, where she can, land a trip and get top heavy side control. She ends up losing those scrambling battles and ends up on her back. And she's been out wrestled and out grappled a lot so far in her, I'll say, relatively young UFC career. And I think that Casey O'Neill is just a nightmare of a matchup for her. So Casey O'Neill next to Nico Price. We'll get to Nico Price, and in the main event are like my three exposed fights that I really, really like. They're high priorities for me. I love the upside of Casey O'Neill. She might be my favorite 9,000 fighter, just because I think the likelihood of her getting a finish is higher than Carol Hosa, and just it's slight. But I also think that the salary savings is why I do prefer Casey O'Neill just slightly.
All right, we have a follow-up super chat from Michael Hammer. And on the other things that I want to ask you about, Pete, is I'm going to ask you about those other two high-priced fighters in Douglas Silva de Andrade. We're going to ask you about Alejandro Perez, and then we're going to talk about that Nico Price fight as well, because I think you and I are both on the same page there. But Michael Hammer here, another super chat from me, says, 3 fighters on FanDuel aside from Correia that you will not have in your MVP spot. Well, I could list more than 3 that I wouldn't like for an MVP on FanDuel, but who are your 3, let's just say overall outside of Correia, which 3 fighters do you think have the least upside today?
Well, I think on that platform, right, you have to target who's going to be defending takedowns and who could possibly pull off a victory. I think that, over on that platform, you start getting to some options that are I'll say least attract, I'm not attracted to a lot of these options, and I don't really play over on that platform because it makes you roster fighters that have to really overcome a lot as far as takedowns are considered. Like Shevchenko will be a popular cheap play because of if she can defend takedowns, her totals are going to be boosted, but I don't see that happening. Christoph Jotko might be a somewhat popular if he can defend Cirkunov's takedowns and possibly pull away late, because Cirkunov is dropping down a weight class. His chin hasn't been the best. His cardio hasn't been the best. If he does not bring his best game, you could see Jotko take over late by defending some takedowns. Again, another spot I'm not really attracted to getting to. I think Devontae Smith, if you're talking about like a good play, is he'll have to defend takedowns as well. Jamie Mullarkey has like attempted like 26 takedowns in his first 2 UFC fights. So, I mean, I don't know. That's more Jason's wheelhouse. I don't know if you play over on FanDuel a lot, but I prefer the DraftKings scoring system.
Yeah, I play more every once in a while. I play on FanDuel, although today I'm doing 4 shows today, so it's hard for me to manage playing on both platforms. But I have my DraftKings lineups loaded up early, but. I mean, there's some fights who also I think we have to look at and just say that there's a lot more than 3 or 4 fighters on FanDuel that I wouldn't want to play in the captain spot, Correia or MVP spot. Correia certainly being one of them. Antonina Shevchenko, I don't think that she's very live for a finish, so she doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. Other fighters, the Stephanie Yeager and Shayna Young fight, that's one that I think that there is some potential upside for DraftKings purposes, but it's still fairly minimal. And I don't think either of them are very likely to get a finish. So for FanDuel purposes, I don't think they make sense. Mike Breeden, mentioned him before as being somebody who very low odds of winning. But I mean, the one to me in particular that stands out would be the Edgar Young fight that I wouldn't want to get exposure to on FanDuel and the MVP. Also, Christoph Jotko as a FanDuel play, even though he's a favorite in that fight, it's just a spot where if you look at Jotko's overall fantasy production, he just doesn't fight in very high scoring fights generally. If he loses, he could give up a lot of fantasy points just because we've seen him get finished before he has a little bit of a questionable chin. But in terms of his actual wins, you're just having his DraftKings fantasy point totals in front of me. His last two, he scored 64 fantasy points in a win over Eric Anders. He scored 76 fantasy points in a win over Marc-Andre Barrio. And just the guy who, once again, even if he is a favorite in this fight, I don't think he's going to score all that well in a win. So somebody else that I'd be fine with leaving out of the MVP consideration. Also, shout out to big guy Kyle Marley, who left a super chat. Look at these studs. Good luck today, fellas. Thank you, Kyle. If you guys don't know Kyle Marley, follow him on Twitter. Let me look up what Kyle's Twitter handle is, because Kyle has
a beast.
Yeah, Kyle also. I want to make sure that I have Kyle's Twitter handle correct. It is Big Marley 3. I knew it was Big Marley something. I wasn't sure what the number was or if there was a number, but Big Marley 3. Kyle also does a great job covering MMA, UFC content, so you guys should be following him on Twitter as well. Let's get into circle back and talk about Douglas Silva de Andrade and Alejandro Perez, because where they're priced, I think that both of them, you can make case them for as being viable plays. However, it's hard for me to really prioritize Douglas Silva de Andrade when he's at 9,200 as a minus 265 favorite in a fight that's like 50-50 in terms of the betting odds to finish inside the distance, when for only $100 more, you can get Karol Rosa, who I think is more upside and is safer. For $200 more, you get Alexander Hernandez, who I also think is much safer. And Casey O'Neill, I think for $200 less, also has more upside. So Douglas Silva de Andrade, while he's not an outright fade for me, he's a low priority play relative to those other options. But can you convince me otherwise?
It's interesting. And it's always good to have a different set of eyes on a slate. And that's why we like bouncing ideas off of each other's heads. I'll say Casey O'Neill and Karol Rosa, my two, I'll say priority plays in that 9,000 range. Alexander Hernandez, given his inconsistencies, is something that I'm okay with being level with the field, possibly slightly underweight. Now, the hard part comes between Douglas Silva de Andrade and Alejandro Perez. I watched the weigh-ins yesterday. Alejandro Perez really doesn't look the same that he used to. He looks a little odd, to be honest. Doesn't look to be in the best shape. Both him and his opponent have been absent from the cage for years now. So now they're both returning. I mean, that seems like a very volatile matchup. I don't really know what to make of it. Between the two, they do have, several decision wins and losses. So I feel like this could get stretched out over 15 minutes. Douglas Silva de Andrade is fighting a fighter who in Gaetano Pirrello, who really pushes the pace and tries to bring it. And I think has only gone the distance once in his career. Maybe not even. I'd have to really check on that. So what I think is like Gaetano Pirrello is really going to push Douglas Silva de Andrade and get him into a firefight. And I think Douglas Silva de Andrade can, return fire, knock him out, or take him to somewhat a sneaky takedown city approach with a late submission or early, we'll say in the second round. I think that Douglas Silva de Andrade is actually really sneaky. And I like him here at 9,200. I think he's going to be slightly under-owned because of the amazing chalky plays that you have in Karol Rosa, you have in Casey O'Neill. Those are going to garner more ownership, and for good reason. But as a third option, I sprinkled De Andrade in multiple lineups just because I do look at his opponent and I'm like, Pirrello fights like a Johnny Walker. He's reckless. He goes out there, he gets in your face, and he makes a ton of mistakes. And on the regional scene, he's been taking to takedown city. That is an avenue for De Andrade, but I don't think he needs to go there. So I actually think that De Andrade is sneaky, buddy.
Yeah. I'm not going to, the other thing I'm going to say though, is I'm not sure, like I understand the merits to him. We have him projected for 28% ownership right now. That's not that much lower than what Casey O'Neill is projected for, or Karol Rosa. We've got 36% on Karol Rosa, 35% on Casey O'Neill. So you're getting a slight ownership discount on Douglas Silva de Andrade, but it's not like he's 15% owned or anything. So, I have to disagree a little bit from that standpoint, that I'm not sure he's going to be massively contrarian. And that's something that still is going to get me more to the plays that I actually like. But for sure, I see some of the merits there. I want to ask you also about Alejandro Perez and his fight against Johnny Eduardo, because You had mentioned before the show that you wanted to talk about some of what you saw at weigh-ins and how that one of these fighters did not look quite like they did the last time you saw them fight. So what do you make of that, and what information do you have there?
It was just a weird stare down. They were extremely aggressive and then friendly, and then it turned into, it was weird. And I thought that, Johnny Eduardo, as far as physicality wise, looked like to be in the better shape. They both are unreliable, and Alejandro Perez looks like on paper to be able to go out there. And if you look at his career as a whole, he has some really, really good wins and some really good experience as well. So I think on paper it looks like he's going to go out there. It just seems so volatile, right? Like it's almost like a women's MMA, low-level women's MMA bout, because they've been absent from the cage for so long. I don't really know what the hell is going to happen in this matchup. I have exposure on both sides. I think I'm maybe 17% for both. I don't have confidence in either side, to be honest. I think they could, bring out some mistakes of one another. As far as 9,000 options though, you can't convince me to get to Alejandro Perez more than Casey O'Neill, Carol Rosa, Alexander Hernandez, Douglas Silva, Andrade. I think Perez will be the lowest owned 9,000 option.
Yeah. Here's one thing also about this. Like, why is Johnny Eduardo fighting? He's 41 years old. He hasn't fought in 3 years. He hasn't won a fight since 2016. So it's been 5 years since he won a fight. That was against Manny Gamburian. I don't really know the reason that he's in this fight. I think that if we get the Johnny Eduardo from 5 years ago, it's probably, at the very least, the line I think deserves to be a little bit closer than what it is, which in itself I think makes Eduardo a viable underdog play. Because if you look at some of the other cheap plays to look at today, it's really slim pickings. Like, I don't want anything to do with Betch Correia. I don't want anything to do with Mike Breeden. I already talked about Antonina Shevchenko. I don't like the matchup for her against Casey O'Neill. I think she's probably going to get taken down a lot in that fight. So we just run out of options in terms of cheap fighters to roster. And just kind of by process of elimination, it's, hey, if I have to roster a fighter in this price range, it's Johnny Eduardo. So I'm going to follow that up by asking you, are there any of these other punt plays that you actually do like? If not, we can talk about the Nico Price fight.
I do. I like Misha Cirkunov, but where are we drawing the line as far as salary? That we're talking under 7,500, because then it starts outside of Johnny
I'm talking Walker. I'm below Johnny Walker. So when we get to Macy Chasson no longer on the card, but Shevchenko, Eduardo, Pirrello, Correia, Breeden, I just look at those fighters and you get to a point where, all right, if I have this lineup construction that's stars and scrubs and I need a cheap fighter, it's just Eduardo to me by default.
Yeah, for sure it is. And my recommendation is, avoid that fight completely in cash. In GPP, you could gain some leverage on the field because it's just they both are low level. Eduardo is a very good striker. I don't know how they're going to look over 15 minutes. I'll be surprised if it does go the distance, but I'm just saying both of them do have several decision wins and losses. And that's kind of my reason. I'm I'll get away from it a little bit. By default, Johnny Eduardo is a guy that I probably landed on a little bit more than I wanted to, just because under Johnny Walker is ugly. Yeah. I don't want to get to Shevchenko. Gaetano Pirrello, not really. Betch Correia, absolutely no. Mike Breeden, okay, he can come from behind, but on short notice, didn't look good. Didn't look like he had a good weight cut. It's Johnny Eduardo by default.
And by the way, I have to address, Sober Delicate says, Greg, I heard that you want a lot to do with Betch Correia, but not in a fighting fight. Sir, that cannot be further from the truth. I'd rather have my neighbor's dog, the guy who lives in the trash can out behind McDonald's. There's a lot of options higher on my list than Betch Correia. She's way towards the bottom. So that is an absolute no for me. Let's talk about the Nico Price fight. One more. If you look at the overall striking stats in this fight, I have to favor Nico Price really heavily. And by the way, also, the amount of children that these two have fathered in between them, this is for the fertility belts right here. We've got Alex Oliveira has 11 kids. And I think it's something, I don't remember the exact number. It's something he has 5 kids with 4 different women that live on his street in Brazil. And then Nico Price, he just had his 6th kid was born. So Alex Oliveira's giving parenting advice in the interviews before the fight. It's No, all right. I don't want anything. He's telling him to get a vasectomy. It's like, who are you to tell people to get a vasectomy? He's probably got, and those are only the kids we know about. I'm sure if he knows
Right.
he has 11, there's at least, like 5 or 6 more out there that he's not aware of. But in terms of the actual breakdown of the fight here, I have to favor Nico Price really heavily just based on volume. Alex Oliveira is so conservative with his strike output, and he's somebody who seems like he has a really exciting fight style because he does weird things and makes really poor decisions in the octagon sometimes. But a lot of his fights kind of end up sucking for fantasy purposes because of his low output. He only lands 2.86 significant strikes per minute compared to 5.29 for Nico Price. Nico Price throughout his career has had a lot of defensive inefficiencies, but I kind of think he's looked a little bit better defensively in some of his recent fights. The fight against Donald Cerrone, which maybe is a washed-up version of Cerrone, but still, Nico Price ended up. It was a draw officially, but it was a fight that I think Nico Price probably should have won. He got a point deducted from the fight against Vicente Luque. I thought Luque was just going to absolutely crush Nico Price in that fight, and even though Luque ultimately ends up winning by third round finish, Nico Price is way more competitive than I thought. He ended up landing 129 significant strikes on Luque. So I just think based on volume, this is a spot that Nico Price, number one, has a good amount of upside. And then number two, I think he should be able to beat Cowboy Oliveira in this spot. But I know you're on Nico Price as well. What are your reasons for being on him?
Yeah, I love Nico Price. He might be my most exposed fighter on the slate. I absolutely love him. I like what I've seen. I know that the results really haven't been there, but if you look at what he brings to the table, it's a high pace. Cowboy Oliveira does not have a high pace over the duration of 15 minutes. He's a round one guy who used to go out there and be extremely aggressive and then fall off a cliff because his cardio is absent. Nico Price is well-rounded. I think he has a sneaky submission arsenal. He hits really, really damn hard, and he doesn't have that quit factor. Whereas I look at Cowboy Oliveira, and Cowboy Oliveira under pressure somewhat folds. I think that Nico Price is a nice parlay piece as well. I have him a part of my parlays. I think that he's mid-priced and actually should be a heavy favorite here. I love Nico Price. I understand that his recklessness at times can make some people question or be worried. I think that this fight will be a part of the optimal lineup. I have zero faith in Cowboy Oliveira. If you do, and you're more of a black and white type of player where you look at stats and potential that Cowboy Oliveira could possibly get Nico Price out of there, go ahead. But it ain't going to be me. I love Nico Price. I don't think that you can get enough of him. 8,400. I think he's the bargain of the slate.
You know how far back you have to go to find a DFS viable outcome for Cowboy Oliveira? Yeah. It's like 7 fights ago against Peter Soli, where he finished him in the first round. Other than that, he lost subbed by Randy Brown. He looked terrible in that fight. Gets subbed in the first round by Randy Brown. Gets subbed in the first round by Shavkat Rakhmonov, which I'm going to give him a pass for that. I think Rakhmonov is super talented. I think he's going to be doing that to a lot of dudes at this level. He beats Peter Sabota, but once again, very low output, lands 45 significant strikes, wins a split decision over Max Griffin, who lands 40 significant strikes. And then his other fights before then, decision against Nicholas Dalby, lands 18 significant strikes, 48 significant strikes against Mike Perry, gets submitted by Gunnar Nelson. He seems like somebody, like I said, would have really good fantasy results. Generally doesn't, and that's not the end all be all in terms of how I would predict fights, except that's the reason also why some of these metrics are so much in favor of Nico Price, just because the output's there. So I think this is also a spot where Nico Price should either win by late finish or win by decision more often than not. The only real outcome I see as a path to victory for Oliveira is he just clips Nico Price early and ends up getting a finish that way. But Nico Price is a much higher priority for my fantasy lineups. Is Oliveira making it into your lineups at all?
0. Unchecked. I might have locked Nico Price in my lineups like that. Like I'm extremely aggressive when I play, and I think that I want all the combinations of Nico Price. Outside of getting clipped from a shot, I don't see how he loses this fight. I absolutely love the matchup.
Yeah, I also think it's a really good match. I'm not totally fading Oliveira just because Nico Price, we've seen him get lit on fire at times and he could be a little reckless. So just because of the power that Oliveira has, I have some exposure to him. But once again, it's a light amount. He's not a priority play for me at all. By the way, if you guys have any questions, do us a favor, fire those into the premium Slack chat, fire them into YouTube chat. We're answering some of those Also, I need to mention that today's show is sponsored by Prize Picks. If you guys are unfamiliar with Prize Picks, these are prop-based daily fantasy sports contests, and they have everything over at Prize Picks. As I pull up the site right now, they usually have sports I've never even heard of when I go look at their website in terms of stuff to play. There's CS:GO, which is coming up in a little bit. You can bet on how many kills some teenagers are going to have. They've had disc golf up there. They've got everything over there, and you can parlay these things together. So maybe you're looking at the UFC card today, and you feel really confident in Thiago Santos winning today, and you also go, hey, that CS:GO slate starts in 15 minutes. I'm going to parlay a couple of those guys together. They have everything over there. Also, what's great, so you want to help build your bankroll, make your first deposit using the promo code Awesemo, get up to a $100 bonus on your first deposit. That is over at prizepicks.com, promo code Awesemo. All right, let's talk about some of these other fights to get to, and we've got about 13 minutes left here to break some of these down. Here's a fight that I'm curious to get your opinion on, because I think this is a fight with a good amount of upside, and that is the Jared Gordon fight. Because if you look at Jared Gordon's output in terms of his fights, it's crazy high. He lands 5.54 significant strikes per minute. In terms of takedowns, very aggressive wrestler, 2.81 takedowns per minute. The only thing that gives me a little bit of pause is that Joe Solecki has generally fought at a relatively slow pace during his UFC career. But I think the just hellish pace that Gordon puts on in every single one of his fights is going to force anybody who fights against him to just have to match him with output. So the Gordon Solecki fight is a pretty high priority one for me. But how about for you?
I actually really love that fight, and I think it's an interesting fight. Gordon's a friend of mine, former roommate, so I'm heavily favored in his direction. I think that he brings a high pace. I think that he has excellent wrestling chops to mix things in, but I think he should be selective here. I think he should use his wrestling to keep this on the feet and possibly pick apart Solecki. Solecki is a great grappler, and I think that's where anybody can run into a problem here in the transitional sequences where you could fall into a trap and get submitted no matter how good you are. Some people really excel in transitioning into setting up submissions, and I think that's where a Solecki is dangerous. I think that Solecki's ground and pound is dangerous, but he looked human in his last fight against Jim Miller, and I think that's what we could use into our advantage in siding with Jared Gordon. The liability with Gordon obviously is getting cracked and hurt from a big shot. But, I think that he can, endure some shots in this fight against Solecki, use his IQ and his strong camp behind him at Sanford MMA to really dominate in certain positions. I always wonder when we have two highly skilled and somewhat similar fighters in a matchup where they could possibly negate each other and the totals don't really accumulate like we were thinking. But I think the pace is an X factor that can somewhat break that mold. And that's where I do favor Jared Gordon because of that high output and that high pace. The volume's there. He just has to be very selective with, the transitions. And if he does go the grappling and take down well, he's an accomplished grappler as well under John Danaher. But, you just got to be careful, right? Like, why go to an area where your opponent is able to threaten you with a possible avenue of success? Stick to what's working, keep it on the feet, use your wrestling and keep it on the feet, and use your Henry Hoofed Sanford MMA kickboxing to really just outpoint him from the feet. So I like this fight, but I thought I'd get a little bit more. I think I have plenty of both sides, but I feel like people are going to view this fight and say, wow, high totals. I'm making it a priority. Is it a priority for you, or are you worried about the skills somewhat nullifying each other?
No, it's pretty high priority for me. Jared Gordon's one of my most rostered fighters, sub 8K, just because he scores so well in his wins. Jared Gordon, his last win, 95 points, and that was as an underdog. And even for him, that was kind of a low total outcome. His other wins in the UFC, 120 fantasy points, 111, 75 against Joaquim Silva, but other ones, 103 fantasy points, 134. His output is so high. Generally, even in the decision, if he wins the decision, he tends to score really well. And another thing to also look at when it comes to Joe Solecki in terms of the matchup and could we see Gordon get chin checked here? Well, Joe Solecki in 13 career fights only has one finish by knockout. He also in the UFC has not landed a single knockdown in any of his fights. So I don't think, obviously it's they're wearing they're wearing the small gloves. It's UFC, anything could happen in the octagon. But I just don't think that's a very likely outcome that we see Jared Gordon hurt on the feet here. So I favor him a decent amount here. And in terms of actual confidence in him winning the fight, I would say that maybe he should be a favorite in this spot, maybe like 130, 135 or so. So it's not like I'm massively confident, but I am very confident that if he wins, he's going to score really well because that's just what he does in terms of DraftKings scoring.
Yeah, excuse me. I think that's absolutely fair. The one thing is like if he's underneath Joe Solecki at any point, the ground and pound, the power I have seen from ground and pound is a little dangerous. On the feet, I think that Gordon can do enough and excel in that department. But man, Greg, I love talking about these fights. I wish we could talk about fights all day long. And I want us to get those likes up over 100. If you guys really appreciate what we do, we appreciate you guys. Just a little bit of time here, and then I'm excited for the fights tonight.
Yeah, and also just quick answer from our Bowden 81 who wants to know who we have more confidence in as an underdog, Gordon or Daukaus. I think I have more exposure to Gordon today. I have a little more confidence in him winning, but in overall terms of upside for GPP, I think it's pretty comparable just because if Daukaus wins, it's probably going to be grappling and wrestling centric against Kevin Holland. So I'm going to have more exposure to Gordon, but I think both of them are good GPP plays today. And also to piggyback on what Pete said, do us a favor, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel because we've got so much content coming up today, even beyond MMA. We've still got the Live Before Lock for baseball. We've got the NASCAR strategy show. We've got a couple football shows. I'm going to be doing about half those shows later today. So I hope to see you guys back later as well. So just a few more minutes left to go here, Pete. One thing that we really need to talk about on the way out, and then we kind of open up for whatever other fighters you want to discuss. The Misha Cirkunov fight against Krzysztof Jotko is a really high priority for me. Also because Misha Cirkunov, when he wins, he scores very well for fantasy purposes, usually grappling based, also capable of getting finishes on the mat. So recent wins for Misha Cirkunov. He scored 115 fantasy points in a really impressive win over Jimmy Crute because I think Jimmy Crute is a really, really strong fighter. Against Patrick Cummins, he scores 111 fantasy points. By the way, Patrick Cummins, very strong wrestler. Misha Cirkunov was still able to get on top of him, control him on the ground. He scored 110 fantasy points to win over Nikita Krylov. Now, typically, when Cirkunov loses, he gets chin-checked and he gets knocked out fairly frequently. But I don't think Krzysztof Jotko is the guy who's really going to be testing his chin. Jotko is not known as somebody who finishes people or really lands knockdowns or knockouts. The last time that he knocked somebody down was Uriah Hall. That was in 2017, a fight that Jotko ultimately ended up losing. To go further back, the last time they actually won via knockout, that was 2016 against Tandem McCrory. So I don't think that this is a spot where we have to be too concerned about the power coming back in Misha Cirkunov. I think he's a better submission grappler than Krzysztof Jotko. So I favor Cirkunov to win. I disagree with the betting line in this spot, but what do you make of this matchup?
Hey, I'm happy he's an underdog because I'm smashing that spot, especially for DFS, because I think the upside is huge. Now, there are given concerns regarding Cirkunov. It's him getting chin-checked and knocked out because of his susceptibility and his somewhat questionable chin at times. There's also the question regarding his cardio. Now, when you're dropping a weight class, both of those are going to be amplified even more. You're going to be susceptible to getting wobbled with other shots, and also your cardio is going to drop off a little bit. But hear me out. He is going down a weight class where it's 20 pounds. It's not 10 pounds. It's 20 pounds that he's going down from light heavyweight to middleweight, which is significant. So I'm impressed that he made the weight and I actually thought he looked good. I think that he can be an overpowering grappler at this division. And I think that he can put Jotko in some terrible, terrible positions. I think he's just going to be stronger than him. So I'm overexposed to Cirkunov, but I still am worried. And I kind of like hedged myself a little bit by getting to a little bit of Jotko, just because I feel like he's in that range where he's kind of lost in the shuffle. There's so many good options at the 9,000. You like some mid-price guys. It's tough to get everybody in your lineup. So I went Jotko in a few lineups in case he's able to somewhat answer Cirkunov, stretch this fight out, and possibly come back from behind. And, I think as the fight goes longer, it definitely favors Jotko. But I'm telling you, Cirkunov has some of the highest ceiling on this entire card. I think that he can get a quick finish or a very dominant and grappling avenue. And I really like Cirkunov here. He's one of my most exposed underdogs on the slate. So I agree with your assessment.
You know what's funny about some of these lower priced fighters here is I think a lot of them have kind of similar outlooks, whether it be Kyle Daukaus or Misha Cirkunov. And I think a lot of these fighters, it's going to be, and we're going to find out pretty quickly. It's, are these guys going to land the takedowns early or not? If they're not landing takedowns, just like, okay, he's going to lose. Like, I think we're going to know a couple minutes into the fight, if these guys are attempting takedowns and aren't able to land them, how realistic their chance of victory is in these fights. But yeah, Daukaus, Cirkunov, I view them as being pretty similar in terms of risk compared to upside. Maybe Jared Gordon to a smaller extent, but once again, I don't think he's that big of a risk to get knocked out in that fight. And then also his volume is so high that I think he could still score at least okay in a win if you're looking for a cash game fighter around that mid-range salary. Now, just a few minutes left here, Pete, but I want to ask you, is there any fighter we have not brought up yet that you think should be known to the people that they're getting to at a decent amount today?
Let me kind of scroll. I mean, we really haven't talked about that Jamie Mullarkey, Devontae Smith fight, and I think that's a sneaky fight to target as well because Smith has KO upside if he can defend some takedowns. Mullarkey has been knocked out in the past, but I think Mullarkey's interesting from a wrestling perspective. If you go back into Devontae Smith's early regional tape in a fight against Gunther, he was taken down to Takedown City, which he can clearly learn from that fight and get better and improve over time. I just think that there is a path there with the very, very durable and tough Jamie Mullarkey. I kind of like that fight a little bit more than I like the Jared Gordon Solecki fight because I am worried about, their skills nullifying each other. But I don't think that you can go wrong with either fight. So definitely consider both of those guys. I think Devontae Smith's kind of at that salary range where he could be lost in the shuffle as well.
Yeah, I think that is also a good GPP fight target. And by the way, another one of those low-price fighters in Jamie Mullarkey, right, where I think kind of in the same situation as Kyle Daukaus, same as Misha Cirkunov. If we see Jamie Mullarkey struggle to land takedowns early, just be like, oh, he is live to get knocked out here, right, or to not succeed in this fight. So a lot of those kind of wrestling-based fighters in the cheaper end of the pricing range that I kind of put in that same boat. And yeah, certainly upside in Jamie Mullarkey. I'm surprised he took such a long time off because he had that pretty impressive knockout win in his let's see, how long did that fight end up going? That win over Kama Worthy. Jamie Mullarkey, that fight lasted 45 seconds. And then he took almost half a year off. I would have thought that'd be one on a pay-per-view card that he'd be looking to get right back into the mix, but took a little bit of time off. But I agree with you. I think that is an upside fight for sure. Anything else you want to say here before we sign off, Pete?
Well, the dad father's just asking me if I could drop a leg or two for a parlay. I'll say that a parlay that I got to today is Nico Price, Carol Hosa, and who did I go with? Nico Price, Carol Hosa, and who did I go with?
I don't know. You're asking me what your bets are. You would know better than me.
Yeah, hold on. I had it for him too.
Was it Douglas Silva de Andrade? I know you said you liked him earlier.
Casey O'Neill. I think that those three together, it makes a lot of sense. You can't go wrong with Douglas Silva de Andrade adding that as well.
All right, that is going to do it for us today, guys. Once again, do us a favor, like the video, and also subscribe to the YouTube channel. Lots of content coming up today. Good luck, guys.
Thanks, guys.